Episode 4 with Hal Rowe.
Where meditation meets daily life, this is the Meditation Freedom Podcast.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Meditation Freedom Podcast. And in this podcast, I basically talk to students and teachers of meditation and mindfulness and just try to find out how they got to it, what drives them to meditate, and what keeps them going. And how do they apply that into their daily lives? How do they bring that meditation and that mindfulness into everyday actions? That's really the interesting part. And in this case, I'm going to be interviewing Hal, who is a student of Zen, and he's done it for a long time, and he's taken some different paths before he got finally settled down into a Zen practice. So hopefully you can learn something from a student in Zen. Before I begin this interview with Hal, I want to just thank a couple of folks who have helped with feedback on this podcast. So that's Michelle Dion from Canada, and then Emma Davies from England, and then Brian Kane from Colorado Springs, I believe, and then Pat Helmers from Chicago. So thank you so much for your help and your encouragement. And before we start the interview, I want to briefly introduce Hal Rowe. He's a great friend of mine and a fellow lover of mountains and outdoors. And he has a deep appreciation for the environment and wild animals, and that's part of the reason why he's active in protecting the environment and land conservation. So Hal's currently a student of Zen Buddhism, and I've always enjoyed the pleasure of doing retreats together. And oftentimes when we go on retreats, it's just, even though they're silent retreats and you're not supposed to say anything, we end up laughing out loud a few times because there's always something to laugh about. In this interview, I talk a little bit about how he got to the Zen practice, and he kind of started towards a meditation practice by reading Alan Watts as a late teen, and then was later influenced by Taoism and Chinese poetry, Tibetan Buddhism, and then finally Zen Buddhism. And in this interview, he also describes how his practice and understanding of being interconnected influences and informs his day-to-day consumption. And then he talks a little bit about dealing with afflictions like anger and greed and cravings. And just a quick note, this was pre-recorded and in a different room, not with a fancy microphone like I'm using right now. And here's the interview with Hal Rowe. Thanks, Hal, for joining this podcast. I want to talk a little bit about how you wound up in Zen, because I know you've taken kind of a different route. You didn't go immediately and thought, okay, this is it.
I don't know. I discovered a connection with Asian ways of thought very early on through actually Chinese poetry. There was a book at my grandparents' house with Chinese poems, and I read that, and I was intrigued at a very young age. Mm-hmm. Some of the pictures were kind of fantastic, but the whole thing, the poems and the pictures, made me go, oh, there's another way of thinking outside this Western world. Then, in my late teens, I discovered Alan Watts and started reading his work and started thinking about meditation, what that was. I grew up small towns in Wisconsin and Iowa, and there really wasn't any meditation teachers. However, in my senior year of high school, there were some TM folks that came to town, and I went to the session, and I was interested, but they were charging a couple $100, and they weren't wavering for me. So I really didn't get involved again till maybe I was in my early 20s. I started reading a lot of the Beats, Gary Snyder, and read Kerouac, the Dharma Bums, about Snyder, actually he was called Jaffe Ryder there, and about Cold Mountain, the poet. And I felt an affinity. I ended up at that time hitchhiking around the country, going into the mountains, hiking with cold mountain poems. And during some of my hitchhiking, I was in Big Sur, and some of the people there started telling me, oh, there's this teacher up in the mountains called Shunryu Suzuki, and this is his book. And I'm like, oh, that's very cool. So I went back, and on my way back through San Francisco, I stopped at City Lights bookstore, bought a bunch of Zen and Buddhist books, put them in a box, mailed them back to me in Iowa, because I really had no exposure. I mean, this was all before the internet and everything. So I found, a bookstore with lots of Buddhism and Zen. Then I went to the University of Iowa, located in Iowa City, and there was a Zen group there. And I'm like, wow. So I practiced with them erratically. I was 21. It interested me and intrigued me.
Was there something that brought you to a physical practice as opposed to just sticking with like an intellectual interest in practice? I mean, was there something that prompted you, I want to practice this instead of just reading about it?
Well, when I read about it, that's what they were doing. People like Gary Snyder, he went to Japan to study in a monastery.
Right.
And so that's kind of how the Dharma bumps ends. And so I'm like, well, you have to sit. And once I got past Alan Watts, who didn't seem to sit a lot, I realized that's what you need to do. And then when I finally found out there was a group in Iowa City, and I went, it's like, oh, this is what you do. Mm-hmm. I need to step back a little. When I went to Luther College, I had a month where they had kind of a seminar in alternate ways of thinking, spirituality, philosophy. And so for 1 month we studied Eastern ways, and that's the first time I really kind of meditated. The professor in that gave us some basic meditation and yoga, and my roommate and I took the course, and it felt good. It felt good. And for 1 month, we quit our partying ways and just became, very, very serious about it. So it touched me then. Like I say, then when I went to Iowa City, it's like, oh, there's a group. So I went and I sat and I practiced, and but it was irregular.
At what point did you start thinking, okay, I want to do this more regularly?
It's been on and off.
Yeah.
I think during some of the 80s, I was fairly serious about practicing. I did a daily practice. I did some weekend retreats with Iowa City Zen Center. A lot of that was I worked evenings. Mm-hmm. So it was really hard, and the group met in the evenings or very early in the morning. So it was really hard for me to practice regularly. When I moved to Spokane in '94, an exciting thing happened that my wife told me there's a Tibetan center just a block away from our house. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going to Padma Ling and studying Tibetan Buddhism and practicing that for a few years, and became fairly deeply involved with it and loved part of the practice. Part of it didn't resonate with me so much. And then I met person, actually your partner, downstairs at the community building, and she was telling me that there's a Zen group, and I had meditated with the group a couple times and gone to their retreats, but I thought, well, I'll try it again. And when I came to it, it just felt right, and I've fallen into it pretty deep and regularly for the past 12, 14 years.
Right.
So I try and do a daily practice. It doesn't always work. I try and do 25 minutes. Sometimes before work, I don't have that. I'll do 10 minutes.
During your work, do you sometimes bring something up from the practice that helps you too? Like in the case like you're totally swamped or something, or there's some difficulty going on at work. Does some of the practice help you at that point?
At those points, I will take a breath, be mindful, just take a breath or two, just follow my breath, the same thing I would do in practice. And generally, after a few of those, I will, that calms me down. If I have a chance, I will step out of my office and go outside and do that. Look into the sky or at the trees and do maybe just 30 seconds of following my breath and go back to the office. And it's amazing how clearing and stress reducing that can be.
Right.
Just kind of clicks. It's just like turning a corner.
And does it help you in your interactions too at that point after you've done a few breaths?
Yes. Say if I'm agitated or angry or frustrated, definitely has a calming effect. I'm human, I don't think anybody, I mean, anger is a part of being human. I don't know that suppressing your anger is really a part of my practice, recognizing it and doing something with it, but not saying, oh, don't get angry. It's more like, I'm angry, I'm upset, so where do I go? Mm-hmm. And there it is. So how do I do this? Turn my anger into compassion. That's part of it. Twist it.
Right.
Turn it.
Transform it.
Yeah, right.
I know you're involved in environmental work. How has this practice influenced your work when you're dealing with oftentimes two extreme, maybe not extreme, but two opposite views in environmental work?
It allows me to be more open to opposing viewpoints and recognize people where they're coming from, having some stillness and quiet in myself. I become more open to them as people. I might disagree on some ideas, but I've found common ground at times. It's rather amazing being
Maybe
sometimes.
Have an example of that.
Well, sometimes being at the table with folks and think their viewpoint on maybe logging and how much they want logged in Pavo Forest differs from what I think should be logged. But we find common grounds and maybe, you like to pack, I like to backpack. Oh, you're a bird watcher too? Oh yeah, very good. And then they go, you have a place in the woods and you guys use chainsaws. It's like, yeah, we do too. We aren't that different in a way. We have a lot of commonalities. We disagree on some points, but we have things in common because we all like to be outdoors.
Right.
So,
have you found anything that surprised you about the practice, in the last maybe 10 years or something that you've practiced?
I think I've deepened. I've become more aware. There's little things that I notice. I've always been aware of bird song and the colors of trees, but maybe that's deepened.
Mm-hmm.
Meeting a teacher and being involved with a group in a tradition that I had learned about and read about years ago, and being involved in that and deepening in that practice.
Right.
So,
because like you said earlier, when you really got into it, it opened up some new insights, where you really deepen your practice. Maybe that you wouldn't have gotten if you were just kind of in multiple practices.
Right. I think the dealing with anger is one thing that turning that around. Finding more stillness as I go throughout the day. Finding a focus in this practice. I think it's important to focus on one practice. A lot of people, when they begin, it's like just being at the candy store and going here and there. And when you finally find a certain practice and you get more and more into it, it's just like spelunking or something, or going into the woods. You're seeing more and more there. Instead of exploring a bunch of caves or a bunch of forests, you're seeing more and more right around you in that practice. And I'm finding through my practice, there's an incredible amount of literature in this specific practice that I find quite wonderful to explore and strengthen my practice.
You actually brought some of your favorite things to read that maybe inspire you the most to continue to practice, that are so beautiful.
Well, I did bring a book of Cold Mountain translations. Cold Mountain, his was a poet in China, and he was kind of a hermit monk. Well, he wasn't a monk. He was a hermit Buddhist, Taoist. Even how much Zen he is, I don't know, but he's very inspirational to a lot of Zen students. Do you want me to read
absolutely.
one or two? Okay. Men ask the way to Cold Mountain. Cold Mountain, there's no through trail. In summer, ice doesn't melt. The rising sun blurs in a swirling fog. How did I make it? My heart's not the same as yours. If your heart was like mine, you'd get it and be right here. One other.
Yeah, you can do a couple more as far as I'm concerned.
Cold Mountain has many hidden wonders. People who climb here are always getting scared. When the moon shines, water sparkles clear. When wind blows, grass swishes and rattles. On the bare plum, flowers of snow. On the dead stump, leaves of mist. At the touch of rain, it all turns fresh and live. At the wrong season, you can't ford the creeks. This is a good one. There's a naked bug at Cold Mountain with a white body and a black head. He holds 2 book scrolls. One the way and one its power. His shack's got no pots or oven. He goes for a walk with his shirt and pants askew, but he always carries the sword of wisdom. He means to cut down senseless craving. My practice kind of goes along with studying Chinese philosophy, Chinese poetry. I've had a long interest in Taoism besides Buddhist practice, because Taoism is a part of Zen practice or has influenced it.
Right.
People differ on how much, but I find its appreciation of nature to be very helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how do you see that influencing the way you live, for example?
I attempt to live simple on the consumption scale. I'm not always successful. I deal with, like most humans, craving, greed. So, but I try and be aware of what I'm purchasing. A lot of my food items, very much aware of where that's from. So I think part of my practice is about interconnectedness and the web of life and being connected on a spiritual level. You're also connected on a physical level, realizing you're part of a bigger world. The spiritual is ecological and the ecological is spiritual. To me, it's not just some mind thing, it's how you live your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And has that affected how you see other people too, that maybe in the past you might have seen as an enemy, for example? How do you see them now as a result of your years of practice?
Well, sometimes I realize that that we're connected, and part of the way that might anger me in other people's behavior, I have some of the seeds of that in myself as well. So I try not to be judgmental, looking at maybe the actions, but not judging or being angry at the person.
Right. So the person loses some of that solid substance that you might have been seeing earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not seeing red at them, but maybe the actions, and realizing there's more to them than just those actions.
Right. Right.
Who knows? I mean, I was born in these circumstances in a very privileged country with very privileged lifestyles. I mean, it was pretty much middle class or working middle class, but that compared to the rest of the world, that's very, very privileged. And I just see ways that other people have acted, or their circumstances could be the same. I could have been in that or act in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. Because you mentioned already taking breaths, but anything else, maybe a quote or something that might help you with in a situation like that, or you recall something?
Actually, I do have a little quote that I actually on my little piece of technology here. I do sometimes do visualizations from some of my Tibetan practice. Part of that I learned in that practice was these 4 roots of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And I try and carry that with me and sometimes go, how am I acting? Am I embodying these? Am I embodying the paramitas, which are different kind of instructions on how to ask? And I can't repeat them all right at this moment. That's helpful. Looking at greed, hatred, and ignorance that we repeat in our Zen vows. Is that, am I embodying that right now? And how can I turn that around?
Mm-hmm.
I said I had a quote
Right.
that I wanted to change to say that I've found lately that I really love. And I kind of carry this around with me and look at it once in a while. And it's from the record of Lao Tzu, Zen teacher. And it goes, if one wants to know the way directly, ordinary mind is the way. Everything is the way. Mind ground is the Dharma gate. Mind ground is the inexhaustible lamp. So I look at that, everything is the way, everything's a way to learn. Instead of sometimes situations being frustrating, they're still frustrating, but you go and examine a little deeper. Well, what is it? What are the cause? What's the effect? How is this all connected instead of that emotional response? I think that's what the practice has helped me with, is like seeing the connections. What caused what? Karma, cause and effect, not just, they did this, now I need to do this.
Do you see yourself continuing this practice, for the rest of your life, or how do you see it that way?
Oh, well, I sure do. I think I have a great teacher, Jack Duffy. I'm happy to find a group. After many years, some of the groups I was in, there were things that just weren't totally connecting. For me, I'm with a group that I'm connected with. I think that's a very important part of practice. If you can find a teacher and a group to practice with, and then you practice regularly on your own when you can't be at those groups, those are very important things, as well as reading.
Mm-hmm.
So I see myself continuing with this till I'll probably be practicing. Hopefully when I breathe my last breath, I'm involved. It's part of me. So.
Oh, great. I want to thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks, Zico. It was good to do and to think about the practice.
Yeah.
And just keep opening to it.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Hal Rowe. And each student, no matter what tradition, is going to have a totally different experience and things to share. And I hope to explore more of that with different students, whether it's Zen or some other tradition that uses meditation and mindfulness. And of course, get teacher perspectives on these paths and practices as well. Now, if you have any comments about this particular episode, or you have further questions for Hal, and that's going to be on meditationfreedom.com/004. And that way you can leave a comment or leave another question, And I also have a link to the website that is associated with the place that Hal practices, so you can check that out. Thanks again for listening, and until the next episode, take care.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Meditation Freedom Podcast, where meditation meets daily life.